Okay, so my name is Lyndsay Woolridge, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about perceptions of linguistic speech characteristics on deception detection. So this is the results of a paper that we recently published in the Journal of Language and Social Psychology. And the focus of our study is on how linguistic features such as accent, speech fluency, and comprehensibility influence our understanding of and our ability to detect deception. So for anyone who was at the APLS conference in March, you've already seen this. There's a little bit of added content just to keep things interesting for you guys, but I've seen some familiar names in there, so sorry for the repetition. So as we know, linguistic characteristics have been studied in the context of both cues to deception as well as impression formation. We know that speech features can significantly influence judgments of things such as trustworthiness and liking, and we've observed this in settings that range from courtrooms to job interviews. And as our society becomes increasingly diverse, we really want to make sure that we understand these dynamics because they're crucial to promoting fairness in legal contexts. And in those contexts, having accurate judgment is absolutely essential. But if linguistic characteristics can bias our judgments, then certain speakers might experience increased suspicion or reduced credibility in these kinds of legal situations. So the purpose of our research was to ask, are we judging truth through an unfair lens, and are we being biased by how someone speaks English? And the primary research question was, do observers' impressions of speech affect deception detection? Or in other words, is there a language proficiency bias in deception detection at different levels of English speakers? And if so, which factors do or do not influence our lie detection decisions? So to investigate these questions, we used a 2x3 research design with veracity and proficiency as our independent variables. To create our video stimuli, we recruited 108 beginner, intermediate, and native English speakers. The mean age was about 23 years, undergraduate students, and we randomly assigned them to watch either an innocuous or a suspicious video. So again, for those who are familiar with research out of our lab, we use the suspicious event paradigm. And basically, what this is a participant comes in, they watch a video, and it either depicts a typical office or it depicts an office with items that are indicative of a potential terrorist plot. So the innocuous items are swapped out one-to-one for more suspicious items, such as a mock pipe bomb, a bomb instructional making manual instead of an HVAC manual, and things of that nature. So the participants watch the video and they're randomly assigned to either tell the truth about what they saw or to lie and say that they had just seen a regular office. So we have everybody testifying in a subsequent interview that they saw a regular office. We then showed these video clips. They're interviewed by the experimenter. We record them and we show the clips to 122 native English-speaking observers. So these observers, I've got some demographics up there for those interested, but they watched 12 videos from a single proficiency group. So that was our between subjects measure. They performed a dichotomous lie detection task, as well as a speech rating task using 9-point scales. And they measured the participant's speech on accentedness, fluency, lexicogrammar, which is basically vocabulary and grammar, and comprehensibility. And they performed these tasks in counterbalanced order. For our analysis plan, we use signal detection theory. So we separate accuracy out into measures of discrimination and bias using D prime and criterion C respectively. And then to see whether or not these speech measures predict lie detection outcomes, we used ridge regression. So our choice in using ridge regression, it was limited by the fact that we had very high multicollinearity among our 4 IVs. So we had expected some overlap. It was a little bit higher than we had anticipated, which is why we chose ridge regression. Our hypotheses were that observers would have poor discrimination between beginner lie and truth tellers compared to any other proficiency group, that they would exhibit a truth bias toward the native speakers, but not either of the non-native speaker groups, and that perceptions of having a strong accent, low fluency, low comprehensibility, and more lexicogrammatical errors, that would be associated with reduced truth lie discrimination and less of a truth bias. So before we did our primary analyses, we looked at any potential covariates, and we actually did find that gender affected discrimination. So this wasn't something we had planned to look at. We just always check for our typical demographics, and we found an effect of gender in here. So we did include gender in our ANOVA on discrimination. So we ran a two-way ANOVA with proficiency and gender, and we did find a significant effect of proficiency. Specifically, discrimination was poorer when observers judged the beginner speakers compared to the other two groups. There were no other significant differences. And we did find a significant effect of gender with females outperforming male observers, but no interaction. And then in terms of bias, we also found a significant effect of proficiency. And this was such that, so we found a significant effect of proficiency, and only the intermediate speakers were different from beginners and different from the natives. So it was just those intermediates that we found an effect for, which we thought was strange. So what we did was we ran a t-test, and we compared the bias to 0, so no bias. And we actually only found a significant truth bias when observers judged the beginners, and no bias when they judged the intermediates or the natives. So with these effects in mind, we wanted to make sure that the participants were actually picking up on these linguistic differences in order for us to assume that that's what's driving these results. So we wanted to make sure they were actually attending to these acoustic differences. And as we expected, we did find that proficiency had a significant effect on how observers perceived the speakers. So we found significant effects across the board. The only area where there wasn't a significant effect was between the beginner and intermediate speakers on accentedness, but all of the other pairings were significantly different from one another on the 4 IVs, as well as a composite measure. We looked at that too, different across the board. So then we examined the ability of these speech dimensions to predict truth-lie discrimination. So I've got the result of the ridge regression up here, just so you can get used to this graph if you haven't seen one before. So using the ridge regression, we separated our data set into a training and test group with 70% of the data for training, 30% for test, and we ran 2 ridge regressions on discrimination and bias. So we used R for this, and we ran the GLMNet package, and it basically finds the minimum value or optimum value of lambda across an array of values that corresponds to the lowest test mean squared error. Lots of jargon. It's a complicated process, but we fit 2 models on our each of our dependent variables. So what we found is that for discrimination, which is shown here, only about 10% of the variance was explained by these perceptions of linguistic characteristics, and our strongest predictor was actually gender. So this was not something, as I said, we were intending to look at, but as you can see, the solid line for gender, the one that approaches 0 the slowest, that's going to be your strongest predictor. So we see gender has a strong effect there, but we're not particularly interested in that for the purposes of this study. So aside from gender, of the linguistic variables, we found that fluency, that's the one that approaches 0 the second fastest, fluency was our strongest predictor. And then the 3 other ones were kind of similar down there, but in terms of actual measures, accentedness was next, followed by comprehensibility and lexicogrammar. That being said, we didn't have very strong model fit, so we're taking these results kind of with a grain of salt. And then looking at our ridge regression on bias, we found that the speech dimensions did not predict bias at all. The values were absolutely abysmal, so there's nothing going on here. So referring back to our hypotheses, we did find that observers were less able to detect deception among the beginner speakers compared to the intermediate and natives. However, it was the beginner speakers that were afforded more of a truth bias, and this was the opposite of what we had expected. And then lastly, lower perceived ability was related to poor discrimination. However, there was no effect on bias. So there's one other thing I wanted to touch on here, and I didn't present on this at APLS, but I thought for this group it might be maybe more interesting. So regarding that beginner speaker truth bias, this is not something that our lab has typically found. This was not what we had expected, and it got me thinking. When I ran my results here, I used for our signal detection analyses criterion C as our measure of bias. However, other papers that have been published from our lab have typically used beta as that measure. So I wanted to do a reanalysis of earlier work from our lab and just see what happens if I run this with criterion C instead of beta. And what I found was that the results actually change. So instead of finding no bias for beginner speakers and a truth bias for natives. So what we saw in the past was with bias, none of the non-native speakers were getting a truth bias, only the natives were. Using criterion C, everybody was. And then I've got my results for comparison below here. So what we care about is that when I use criterion C, which is a better measure, it doesn't have as complicated as of decision-making likelihood rules. It's a more straightforward measure. It's more recommended in the field now. But when we use this, we do see that beginner speakers are afforded a truth bias across our studies. And there's also been a third study from our lab that was published in 2022, and it found the same thing. So we are now seeing a truth bias toward these beginner speakers that we hadn't previously been observing. So what is today's takeaway? We found that observers were better able to detect deception among native speakers compared to non-native speakers. However, there was this truth bias toward the beginner speakers and no bias towards the others, suggesting that lower proficiency led to poor discrimination, but not necessarily to a negative bias. And importantly, speech perceptions had no effect on response bias, but did influence discrimination. So this is somewhat encouraging because perceptions of accent might be less likely to bias decision-making than we had previously thought compared to, say, the actual content of the speech. So future work would benefit from explicitly testing this benefit of the doubt that seems to be occurring with our beginner speakers. And this may not be an effective deception detection strategy when interacting with other populations. Thank you very much. That's it for me.